So I have this friend of mine who you would call probably a pen pal, who's in Adelaide, South Australia. His name's Ronnie. He calls himself Wee Ronnie. Wee Ronnie. I'll wave to him because he might be watching. So, and he just wrote me years ago and has been a great encouragement. He writes the craziest things to me, and I write crazy stuff back to him. And he's in his worship band there in Adelaide. It's just a really neat thing. So I told him, I said, one of these days, I'm going to get on an airplane and come visit you in Adelaide, South Australia, And I thought, it's too expensive and we're too busy and this never going to happen. Until last year, I saw that something was going to happen in Adelaide. I thought, gee, that might push me over the hump to go. And it was this. Yeah, this guy, it was actually the farewell tour. It was a kind of a closing tour of this guy. His name is Max Pelicano, and he's probably one of the best Elvis impersonators in the world. And you'd fly to Adelaide for that? Well, this guy, if you see him online, it's called Elvis to the Max. And he's getting out of the business, he's retiring, and he's a much bigger deal in Australia than he is here in the United States. But I wore an Elvis suit once at work, but we can't go into that. But I thought, this guy's really something. And part of the farewell tour, it was going to be last year, September, in Adelaide. And I thought, wee Ronnie, let's go to Adelaide. And we'll do this. That wasn't going to happen. So why did I put that up to today? Because it was his farewell tour. And today is Elijah's farewell tour. See, stupid connections, I'm sorry. So today we're going to look at the Chariots of Fire. This is really the farewell tour of Elijah, the regular guy, just the regular guy that God used in powerful ways. And the movie Chariots of Fire got its title from this. Just like last week we had a whole bunch of stuff that came out of that. This is it. So, however, Max Pelicano's farewell tour did not get its name from this. Okay, let's try it. So we're back. Elijah had served the purpose of God in his own generation, and the Lord was now ready to take him away. But Elisha, Elijah's trainee, now continues his master's work in the service of God to the wayward northern kingdom of Israel. So that's where we are today. Remember, he's been training on a guy, Elisha, who's going to take up what he's doing in the country. And today, Elijah is coming to his end. But it's kind of an odd way. Let's take a look. So we're in 2 Kings, and we're going to be at Gilgal today. And we're going to travel from Gilgal down to a very important place in Israel, Bethel. We're looking towards the southeast, and that thing in the background is the Dead Sea. And so we're in the hill country that's pretty far north of Jerusalem. Jerusalem on here is that kind of dark thing to the right on this map. So we're going to be in this hill country north. Samaria, where Jezebel and Ahab and all that happened, is behind us right here. So we're in the center. Bethel's a very important place in Israel. So we're going to go from Gilgal to Bethel in the beginning of our farewell tour. Okay, so let's see what he says. Here we go. 2 Kings 2. Now, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha, so don't get them confused, were on their way from Gilgal, and Elijah said to Elisha, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives," go back, we got to find out what that was. Okay, it double-clicked. "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. So see, we start the farewell tour. We're in Gilgal. We're going to walk to Bethel. And Elijah, the guy, who's in charge, says, "Elisha, stay here. I'm moving on." And Elisha says, "Nope, I'm coming with you." So they go on to Bethel. And the sons of the prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, who are the sons of the prophets? Remember, there was like a remnant of protected priests and prophets at the time. Well, the thinking is that there were these distributed kind of schools for these guys who were being trained up in how to be, prophets, how to be priests in the areas. And so there was one school in Bethel. So these guys who were in this school come out and say to Elisha, "Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you?" Whoa, bummer. And Elisha's been with Elijah for, we think, a couple of years, maybe more. We don't know how long, but they're saying, "Do you know, Elijah, do you know today he's out of here?" And Elisha's response is, Yeah, I know it. Keep quiet. Or in our vernacular, yeah, I know. Shut up. He just doesn't want to hear about it. And in fact, this separation, I don't know how all these guys knew this. The prophets that were in this school in Bethel knew it. You'll see in a second, others knew it. Elisha knew it. Elijah knew it. Everyone knew that this was the day that Elijah was going away. I mean, what? So Elisha really doesn't want to hear it. So they go someplace else. They go from Bethel down to Jericho. Now, Jericho is down in the low altitude. It's below sea level, down by the top end of the Dead Sea. So as we come out of the hill country in the north, that's actually technically Samaria where we are. Then there's Jericho down there. If you've ever been to Jericho, you'll probably be taken to a place that has a lot of water running. It's because the only reason Jericho is in Israel is because there's a spring that comes out of the hills there. And you'll see actually a lot of water, springy stuff. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, they go down to Jericho. They're well below sea level there, and they take off down there. So Elijah says to him, Elisha, please stay here, that is at Bethel, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho. But he said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So this is the good disciple speaking. You're going to stay with him. And I think we don't really know why Elijah kept saying, stay here, I'm moving on. But it could be because he's trying to save him from the heartbreak of the separation. Could be. We just don't know. But he says, nope, I'm going to stick with you to the very end. I will not leave you. So they came down to Jericho. So now they've crawled out of the hill country in Samaria, and they're down at Jericho at the top end of the Dead Sea. And the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho, it was another kind of school there. The sons of the prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, ready? Did you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you? Well, who doesn't know about this? Everybody knows. So they come out and they say, Elisha, it's basically them saying to him, are you okay? Are you fine? You know this is going to happen. You okay? And of course, Elisha's answer is, yes, I know it. Shut up. So keep quiet. I don't want to deal with this emotionally. And this is in Jericho now. Scene 3. Then we go from Jericho to the Jordan River Valley. Well, the Jordan River comes from the left in the north in Sea of Galilee, and it's that dark streak you see right through there. That's the Jordan River. It comes down and fills up the Dead Sea down in the south. And we're going over the Jordan River. So really the trip from Jericho to the Jordan River is not a real big deal. I mean, it's right there. So they go down to the Jordan River. So Elijah said to him, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan. And Elisha's answer is, no, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So he's going to stick by him to the very end. And the Lord's leading Elijah to these places, from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho to the Jordan. And Elisha's just going to stay with him. Come on, clicker. So the two of them went on and they went down to the Jordan River. So 50 men of the sons of the prophets from Jericho also went and stood at some distance from them as they both were standing by the Jordan. So you see the picture, they've left Jericho, they got the guys from the school of prophets there, and then as Elijah and Elisha walk out of Jericho east over the Jordan River, they go that way, and these guys follow at a distance, kind of a respective distance. They just want to see what's going to happen, and they just go with him. But it's Elijah and his apprentice Elisha who go up to the edge of the river. So that's where we are right there. Scene 4, we actually cross the Jordan River. So we get up to the edge of the Jordan, and we go on over to the other side. Now this is historically reminiscent of so many things we'll talk about later about the Jordan River. So they cross the Jordan River. That's what it looks like today. Oh, that's kind of bad color. So they go over the Jordan River. So verse 8, so Elijah took his cloak, that's the kind of wraparound outer garment, rolled it up, and struck the water. And the water was parted to one side and to the other till the two of them could go over on dry ground. That's actually the miracle is the dry ground. The parting, but then you don't actually slog through the mud. You go through on dry ground. So does this remind you of anything? Yeah, okay, just store that for a second because this is sort of interesting. And technically speaking, when you walk across the Jordan River onto the eastern side, you're technically walking out of Israel. Okay? So, in fact, to this very day, that's true. When you cross the Jordan, you're actually into the country of Jordan. So it's a real demarcation line. So they go across on dry ground. By the way, I did put in this bottom down here. Check out Joshua 4. That's what you're probably thinking about. You can go read about that later. Verse 9. So when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, okay, ask what I shall do for you before I'm taken from you. So everyone knows this is coming right now. So what do you need, Elisha? Ask me what you need. And Elisha has a very interesting response. Elisha says, please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me. Yeah, a double portion. Does that remind you of anything too? Come on, you're Bible scholars. The oldest son in a family of sons, the oldest son, when he inherits from his father, inherits a double portion. So he's speaking as though he's the oldest son of Elijah, which is actually a sort of okay in terms of a spiritual thing. You know, he was his apprentice. He's the only one. Asked for double portion. It's a way of actually complimenting Elijah and saying, I want to continue what you've done. I want to have like twice as much of whatever it is you've got to do the same thing. It's not a real selfish. It's not an ego thing. I want to be competent in what I do and picking up the mantle of what you've done. So I asked for double portion. It's like the double portion for the oldest son in Deuteronomy 21. So Elijah says, you've asked a hard thing. Yet, okay, if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so. What? Well, in a sense, what you hear is Elijah saying, I don't really have the authority to give you what you ask. It's a hard thing. I don't have this. But I'll tell you, here's the deal. If in my transition out of here, you see me, then I think it's in the works for you. If you don't see me, maybe not. So he's really not giving it to him. He's giving him an indication of whether or not he'll have this. So this is God's choice to do. So basically, this is a way of stay tuned and let's see what happens. Verse 11, and as they still went on, they walked past the Jordan further east and talked. Behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. Whoa. That is kind of cool. So they're walking, and you have to envision that they're walking side by side as they walk east, and all of a sudden something comes and separates them. And what separates them is this thing. It's the chariots of fire and horses. It's crazy. But clearly God has come between the two of them. It's his way of saying he's coming between Elisha and his master Elijah and separating the two of them. And it's kind of a symbol of God's power and might. There's a lot of these pictures. I pulled one of them out right here. Isaiah 66:15. Behold, the Lord will come in fire, and his chariots like the whirlwind, to render his anger in fury and his rebuke with flames of fire. So is this issue with Elijah and Elisha a fury thing? No. But what I'm saying is that anytime where God intercedes in the historical timeline of men, it's with power and might, and it's symbolically like this. So it's a clear way of God with his might saying, I'm coming between the two of you. I'm doing this, and I'm separating you two. And there's other passages right there you can read. It's a very common kind of thing. So as soon as you see these chariots of fire and horses of fire, it's without question, it's the hand of God that's separating them, that's coming between them, that's entering into the history of these two men. So that's what he's trying to say. And then Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. If you're a good Bible scholar, you'll notice he didn't go up in the chariots. He went up in a whirlwind. So these chariots and these horses separated the two of them. But in the end, he went up in a whirlwind. Like one of those dust devils came down the desert and pulled him right out. Something like that. So that's exactly, I'm planning on going that way too. That's what I want to do. I want to go out in a whirlwind. I had a problem when I was studying this. I read this and all I could think of was scenes from that tornado movie. Twister? Yeah, with the car going up, and that's all I could, something like that. So actually, technically, scientifically, it's possible to lift up heavy things and take them away. So there you go. Anyway, so he goes up in a whirlwind into heaven. And it begs a big question. And I think literally this happened. I can't challenge the literalness of this. This happened. The question is why didn't he just die? Why be taken in a whirlwind up to heaven? And we'll talk about that some. I'm just planting that seed for you to start thinking about and distract you for the next couple minutes. Why didn't he just die? Wouldn't that have been fine? In fact, interestingly enough, they're on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and they're continuing to walk east. They're going basically into an area that's Moab. And in that picture I showed you with the Dead Sea on the upper right, those mountains behind the Dead Sea is where Moses went up and died. So, that's an interesting parallel too. So we'll have to think about this for a second. So anyway, Elijah's taken up by a whirlwind. Clearly from verse 11, the hand of God is doing this. He's separating these two men. Once they're separated, Elijah goes up into whirlwind into heaven. So hold your questions about that, because that's kind of interesting. Now when Elisha saw it and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel have, wait, where'd that go? I hate when it does that. The chariots of Israel and its horsemen. My clicker's not working great today. I have to apologize. I don't know why. Chariots of Israel and its horsemen, and he saw him no more. So again, see, he cries, my father, my father. Again, the double portion idea. Elisha is, in a sense, he's like a son to Elijah, who's the father, who's the master. So it makes a lot of sense. And the fact that he does it, he says it this way, my father, it's a grieving kind of phrase, as you would say that if your father had died. But then the next phrase is, but he didn't just die, God deliberately did this. There's no question God is the one who came up with the idea of taking Elijah. God's the one who interceded between the two of them. God's the one who changed the history of these two men. God's the one who's done this. It's deliberate. And it does raise kind of a nice, what do you want to say, a comforting thought, which is any of these separations that we deal with in life are not accidental. And in this particular case, it was very not accidental. It was deliberate on God's part. Just like was said about David when they were talking about David. In a sense, he had finished his job in his generation, and it was just time to be done. Interestingly enough, if you think back a couple of weeks ago, remember that Elijah was given a task to do a handful of things, to find Elisha, to make him his apprentice, to put Jehu as the king of Israel, a handful of to enthrone a king in Syria. Remember, he had a task list to do? The only thing he did on that task list was find Elisha. The other things are still undone. So the undone things of Elijah are now Elisha's job. So again, God can give this assignment to Elijah, but it's not like Elijah has failed because he didn't do them. It's a continuing thing that God's doing, and you're not indispensable. You do part of it, and then you stop, and then other people pick it up. There's a real continuity in what God is doing amongst us, that you are not indispensable. But you do have a part to play, an important part to play in the part you have it. But then when it comes to an end, well, it comes to an end. And it's not accidental, and you didn't fail. It's God saying, that's enough. We're done. So that's what I've had this thought many times in ministry, because as we've gone through different ministry kind of venues, I'll say to myself, well, gosh, I could have still been doing this. I could have still been productive in what I was doing. And then the events seem to kind of turn upside down, and they stop it. And because if it was my choice, I'd still be doing what I was doing. But in a real sense, God took the situation, turned it on its head, and said, no, I need to intervene and stop what you're doing. Well, why? Because I'm a failure at it? No, because I have other things to do, and someone else will pick up what you're doing. Don't worry about it. So that's God. That's what God does with all of us, not just with Elijah or Elisha. And then we cross back over. So now Elijah's gone. He's been taken up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha crosses back over the Jordan River and comes back to Jericho. This is what Jericho looks like today. It's actually quite lush. And it comes from a spring, now two springs, that pop up at the bottom of those mountains. If you wanted to go to Jerusalem from here, we're facing directly west. If you want to go to Jerusalem, you'd go right up this crack in the mountains, right up here, and climb up to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's at the top up there. Jericho's down low. So now Elisha crosses back over. So he took hold of his own clothes and he tore them in pieces. Common sign of grief. That's all it is. Loss and grief. It's as though he had lost his own dad. So he tears his own clothes. It's interesting he says his own clothes, because next is some clothes that aren't his. And he took up the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. So evidently, this whirlwind that took Elijah up, it sort of ripped off his cloak and it fell down to the ground, and it was right there in front of him. Which is actually not just that's a symbolic thing as well as a material thing. Because remember, when he called Elisha, he took his cloak off and basically, so in that sense, your cloak, your most outer garment tells everyone what you do and who you are. And so when Elijah called Elisha while he had the 12 oxen, that cloak was a big part of it, because it's a way of saying who I am and what I do is now going to be you. It's as easy as taking this off and putting it on you, that job has been placed on you. So that's really what's going on. So as Elijah goes up to heaven, his cloak that's blown off comes down to the feet of Elisha, and he picks it up, and he stands at the bank of the Jordan. And then he took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him, and he struck the water, saying, "Where's the Lord, the God of Elijah?" Now, he's not doubting that God's there. This is the first thing that he's ever done after Elijah's gone. And it's his way of saying, well, here we go. The God of Elijah, if you're not with me, this is going to work. So where are you? And he has to get back across the Jordan. And so when he had struck the water was parted to one side and to the other side, and Elisha went over. It's the first time that he'd done something like this, and it was really great encouragement, we have to think, for Elisha, because he's thinking, well, I'm picking up after Dad. Well, I'll roll up his cloak and I'll hit the water and we'll see what happens. Where's the God of Elijah? And the answer implicitly to his question is, right here. Right here. Yeah, right here. Ah. We're done. But we have to do some thinking and praying. Because next time we look at this, we're going to be following Elisha. Elijah's off the map. Now remember, as I'm thinking about Elijah, we started looking at Elijah, asking ourselves, why is it that Elijah is so prominent in the New Testament? He's there when so many other guys from the Old Testament aren't there. Why is Elijah there? So we said, let's go look at the life of Elijah, and we just finished it, and you've seen everything. So the question is, why is Elijah a big deal? I mean, that's what you really have to do when you get to the end of this story. We've passed on the baton to Elisha. Well, why? What is that? That's it? So because of that lifetime, we've seen the entire timeline of Elijah. So for that reason, he shows up in the New Testament? Well, remember we said there's some similarities between he and Moses? I started making a list. This helps us a little bit. Moses has a lot of parallels with Elijah. And it's not accidental. And Elijah's not trying to live like Moses to try to do this. It's just as there. So I made a list, for instance. Both of them had a revelation from God at Mount Horeb. Remember, Mount Horeb is where the Ten Commandments, all that kind of stuff. And remember when Elijah was running away because he was scared to death of Jezebel? But he went really far away. I mean, he went all the way down into the Sinai, went to Mount Horeb, had some discussions with God there. So both of them have a history with Mount Horeb, which is interesting. An interesting parallel. So I stored that up, made another one. That golden calf experience with Moses and Aaron and then the prophets of Baal, those two episodes have a lot sort of in common. They're big events, big confrontive events that happen. And I thought, there is kind of, now they're not an exact parallel, but I thought, that's kind of, okay, I see that. That's an interesting deal. How about the fact that at the end of their lives, both of them crossed over the Jordan into the eastern side? And for Elijah, it was to be taken up in a whirlwind. For Moses, it was to go up into the mountains and die under semi-mysterious wording. Anyway, but the same kind of thing. They literally walked out of the land of promise back to where they had come from, as though they had come in to do their stuff and left. Now, Moses never got in. He never got in, but Elijah came out. So it's as though they came out of the promised land. They were outside the promised land, finished what they were going to do with the promised land, and when they were done, they're gone. That's interesting. Another one I wrote down, this mysterious departure. That's what I was just talking about. Going up in a whirlwind for Elijah. Moses died. Now, I got to tell you that. Moses died, but the way it's written, it makes you scratch your head and go, well, that's an odd way to die. There's just oddness to it. So some speculation is that Moses never died. Well, the passage says he died. But what is this thing about going up on the mountains and nobody knows where his grave is to this day? And there's just a little mystery around it. So they both come out of the western end of the Jordan into the eastern, and they both of them kind of gone. And no one sees Moses die. Anyway, that's interesting. And the apprentice for both of them continues the work. For Elijah, it's Elisha. For Moses, it's Joshua, yeah. So he's the one that actually takes them into the promised land. They both have apprentices that continue the work and get it done in that sense. And that's an interesting distinction, that they stopped short of something and then someone up took the job for them. And it was God himself that stopped them and made them hand over. So lots of parallels. Not to mention the fact that at Jesus' transfiguration, Matthew 17, We have a guest appearance by Elijah and Moses. So, Elijah and Moses have, God is doing something to tell you that they're accomplishing the same end, but different ways or different times. There's something, and none of these events historically are meant to be accidents. They're meant to tell you something. So when you see this much parallelism, you have to step back a couple more steps and think and pray and say, God, what are you saying about these guys? Because this isn't accidental. This is deliberate, and it's by your design. Remember, Elijah, when he's doing his farewell tour, he's circling around some very important places until he crosses the Jordan by God's command and gets to the other side and is taken away. It's all God's doing. So God's trying to tell us and to tell the Israelites, Moses, Elijah, and there are no other notable people in the Old Testament that have this kind of parallel to Moses. Elijah does. And I think this is why we're starting to see why he shows up in the New Testament. There's something that has great parallelism between these two, which is why he shows up in the New Testament. Now, we could spend hours trying to think through this. And I don't think there is any one right answer, but you can make some easy, simple connections. And as I was thinking through this, I just, once you have the narrative in your head, it's fun to just spend some time closing your eyes and thinking about this. Let me give you a quote, because this will help us down the line faster. This guy Rowley is an evangelical commentator from the 1960s. He said, without Moses, the religion of Yahweh as it figured in the Old Testament would never have been born. But without Elijah, it would have died. So in a sense, the Old Testament, with God bringing the Israelites into the land, that was the beginning of the job. Joshua had to continue it. But in a real sense, once they'd gotten into the land of promise, by the time of Elijah, they had lost everything in their connection with God. They were blowing it. They were going the way of the Canaanites. They were just going down. So in a real sense, this promise of living in this land with God as king in the center was something that God used Moses to start. But it's something he used Elijah to try and continue. You see that? Moses brought him in, but the nation by itself was taking itself out. Elijah was the one who came in to correct it. Because remember what he did with Ahab and Jezebel and the prophets Baal and all that kind of stuff. And the nation had clearly turned a corner going to weird stuff. They were doing worship of Baal, the Phoenician one as well as the Philistine one. They were way off the rails. And the northern kingdom had gone off the rails like 60 years before this, because they had this civil war with the southern part of the nation, which is where the temple is. I mean, they were already way going off the rails. And this continued without abatement until Elijah came, and he started to push against that. Say, no, you can't do this. Now, because of the work of Elijah and some other prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and those guys, it'll forestall an event that's going to happen about 100 years after this, which is, although the nation of Israel doesn't go off the rails totally, it's so far that God says, okay, listen, I've done all I can do to keep you in this land. If you want the Assyrian gods and the Assyrian people and the Assyrian culture, then I'm going to give you to the Assyrians. There you go. Have at it. So he does that. And then about 150 years after that, the southern kingdom, which had been doing much better, goes through the same process and goes to Babylon. So in a sense, the nation as God had designed it to be in this land, where God was at the center. The land itself wasn't magic. What was magic was God was living in their midst. Once they rejected God, well, the whole contract was off. But Elijah and those other prophets tried to forestall it. And so they made it that when they went into captivity in Assyria, they would remember, because of what happened with Elijah and all those guys, that suddenly came to them as they were in captivity. We're here because we did this to ourselves. And that's what Elijah said. That's what Jeremiah was saying. That's what Isaiah was saying. We did this to ourselves. So really, the message of Elijah wasn't to stop that fall. It was to slow it and to allow them to hear the voices from God, from all these different guys, so that once they got there, they'd realize the enemy is not the Assyrians. The enemy is us. Because the design of the nation of Israel, again, wasn't a place that was magical all by itself. Like you get a deed to a piece of land that's got everything you've ever wanted. It was a nice place, but the place didn't run unless God was at the center of their hearts and of their community. And that was the design of Israel. Israel was meant to be a testimony to the world of what life in community with God, with him at the center, could be. But as soon as they rejected God as the center of their community, the land would not provide for them anymore. And God said, I'm going to drop all the defenses and you're going to get taken away because I'm going to give you what you want. And that's the sobering thought. And Elijah was one of those voices that stopped the downfall. In a sense, he was at the end of this process of coming into the land, living under God, where Moses was at the beginning. But the point of both of them was to say, live in this land. You live in this land by loving your God, allowing him to be king. That's how this works. The land is okay, but God's at the center. That's what makes it work. Okay, so I can see what he's saying. Both of these guys had the same intent. That was to turn the hearts of the people of Israel to God and have him be the center of everything. So in that sense, they're kind of doing the same thing. And as I thought about this, I thought, well, that's interesting because that means in a way from God's plan, Moses played the role of being one of the founders of this effort, bringing the people into the land, out of Egypt and into the land. He was sort of a founder. And in a sense, Elijah and the other prophets that came after him were guys who tried to sort of perfect their views so that they would always put God at the center of everything. He tried to steer them in that sense. And it was an ongoing, multi-year process. In a sense, so you see, Elijah didn't start these things. He tried to kind of perfect them in the sense of fine-tuning the hearts of the people toward God. And as I saw that, then it made me think of a passage in Hebrews 12. Looking to Jesus, who's the founder and the perfecter of our faith. So really, you can look at Moses and Elijah together as a picture of Jesus. Where Moses was used by God to take the Israelites out of the prison of Egypt and into a land of promise. In the same way, Jesus, in what he did for us for salvation, took us out of the land of oppression of sin and into a land of promise where God's at the center. Really, because remember, salvation at its core, the word means to be put out in an open place, which means to be taken out of the jail, the close confinement, and be put out in the open, to escape. It's really a rescue mission is what I think of. That's what Moses did for the Israelites. That's what Jesus did for us. The beginning of our walk with him, he pulled us out of the jail and closeness of sin, and he brought us and set us in a place where we can find life because of him. But that life really wasn't because of where he brought us. It was because of him, and always was about him and his presence. With Israel, once they took their eyes off of who God was, the whole deal was off. The whole deal was off. In fact, if you wind back earlier in the nation of Israel, you go back to the beginning where you start to have kings in Israel. And the first king was Saul. The second king was David. Then you have Solomon. Then after Solomon, the nation splits. They have a civil war, and you make your way up to Ahab and all those bad guys. Well, when you see Saul come on the scene, and there's a guy by the name of Samuel who's the prophet in the nation of Israel, the people have this clamor. They say, we want a king. We want a king like everyone else has a king. Why can't we have a king? We want a king. And they're really pushy about that. And they get their eyes on Saul, who's a pretty good-looking guy like me. Well, but he's tall. He's taller than other people. So they see him, and he looks like a king. Remember that whole account? He looks like a king, so they make him king. But before they make him king, the prophet Samuel, who's kind of, he's keeping the spiritual reins of the country, he gets so mad when the people ask for a king. And when he goes to God, there's a great conversation between he and God. He goes to God and said, God, this isn't right. They want a king, and you're the king. You're the king of this nation. This is not right. Let's say no. Let's target it. But he's really indignant about this because the original intention of Israel was to have God as king. Always was, always will be. And he said that when he brought him in the land, follow me, keep your eyes on me, because the source of life comes from me. It doesn't come from the land. But this is a place where we can do this together. Samuel gets really ticked off, and God says, let's just go with what they ask for. And they get warned. They get warned that, you put a king in place. He's going to take your sons. They're going to go to war. They're going to die. He's going to tax you. You really should keep the king, the God of Israel. But if you want a man king, well, this is what you're going to get. And that's exactly what happened. Saul was a bad king. David was a better king. But still, he had his problems. His sons died in battle. All this kind of stuff. And it's interesting that when Samuel says, your sons are going to be taken by the king, it's implicit in that God was going to be such a great protector of Israel, as the king of Israel, that they would never have to have a standing army. That's the implication. Wow. And what a testimony that would have been to the world when the Syrians or the Assyrians or the Babylonians, any of those guys would want to come in and invade, they'd get to the edges of the border, and without a single man with a sword on the edges, God would say, no, you're not coming in. What a testimony. Who's in charge of these people? The nearest thing you can see to this today was the Six-Day War in 1967 in Israel. And I'm a war buff of many kinds of wars, but I've read several books on this. And what happened should not have happened, just frankly speaking. It should not have happened. Because you had every neighbor of Israel armed up and invading into the country. And we're talking everyone. We're talking everyone. You know, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians, I mean, Lebanon, everyone is coming in to squash this little country, which is about the size of New Jersey, by the way. But they don't get squashed. And everyone said, this is a miracle from God. This says something about their God. Well, that's just a weak version of what God had intended to do in showing the world that for those whom I love who live in this country, you will never touch them. But when they came and got a man-king, things started to go to pot. So God was meant to be the center all the time. So Jesus is the one who brings us into a land of promise, of life, like Moses did. And now that you're in this land of promise, you're justified, you're his, there's still an ongoing program that goes on with you, right? To kind of change you, and that's the word we call sanctification. There's this slow process that happens where he continues to work in your life. So it's not as though you come to Jesus, you put your trust in him, he brings you into a land of promise in terms of where you're at, and then he says, I'm done, out of here. Well, in the New Testament, you don't see that at all. At the end of Matthew, he says, I'll be with you always to the end of the age. You look in Acts, guys, you look in Acts, you see the Holy Spirit doing what the Holy Spirit does. There's ongoing process that happens after the point of giving your life to Jesus that happens. And like Elijah, who tried to keep their hearts steered toward God, Jesus also in our lives today keeps our hearts steered toward God and changes us in the process. So in a real sense, not only is he the founder like Moses was of our faith, but he's also the perfecter. He's the one that continues to work with us ongoing forever to sanctify us and to change us. So in a real sense, Moses and Elijah had the same intent. That was to create a community of people who had God at the center. Moses was in the beginning, Elijah was in the corrective end. Jesus is the one who comes and brings us into this land of promise, coming by faith and salvation. Jesus is the one who continues to do the ongoing process of steering our hearts and keeping them on God. So that's what you see between these two guys. Now, before we finish, you'll notice I took this phrase right out of context. You got to see the context of this, because clearly Jesus is the beginning and the ongoing perfecter. And when we say perfecter, that word comes from this very famous word, teleos, which means the end of something, or the goal of something is what it is. So if you do something like we're right after January, so you went on a diet January 1st, and you had for yourself a goal of where you're going to be in terms of pounds, and so you start the process in January. Here we are in the middle of February, and every day you check that goal. You climb on the scale, you check the goal. Well, that's your teleos. That's your perfection point. That's what you're aiming at. It's the reason and the purpose why you change your food intake. So when we talk about perfecting, in this case, this word really has much more to do with getting to the point of your purpose. Getting to the point of your purpose. And so what Jesus does is he constantly works in us and through those around us to bring us to the point of our purpose, that goal. Yeah, Steve.
Not to be perfect.
Not to be perfect. This word has nothing to do with sinlessness.
That's the problem. Is
Yeah.
the word is not. It doesn't do pales any justice.
Right. We're already right with God. We're already justified. We've been brought into the land of promise. But there is still this lingering stuff of sin, and I won't say that sanctification has nothing to do with sin. It does. It has a lot. But his point isn't to make us sinless per se. It's to make us conform to his purpose for us for all time and everything, which includes sinlessness. But that's not the only thing. So you can ask yourself, what's the purpose of man? What's his goal? If God started this process, he made us. What has he made us for? What's the purpose? What's the teleos of all that? And we can say relationship with God, but sin gets in the way of that. So sin's part of that process. So Jesus is the one who's constantly in the process now, yes, of weeding out sin, of changing our attitudes, changing our appetite for sin, which is an amazing thing. It's nothing I have any control over. This is what's going on. So he brought us in like Moses did, and he keeps us on track like Elijah did, to point us back to the heart of God. So we'll just close with Hebrews 12, and based on Hebrews 12, we can see what we're supposed to do. What came before it was this. So therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let's also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let's run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now, this is the process. This is the diet. The race is the diet. So let's run this thing toward this goal, and let's do it. Part of that is letting go of sin so you can run that race. You can go somewhere. But using this Olympics kind of metaphor, he's saying you're in the process right now of running in the direction to a goal. What is that goal? And how do you get to that goal? How do you make that happen? Sin can stop you, but that's not everything. There's more to it. So what is the teleos? What's the goal for a track runner? It's very clear. You know, there's a tape across the thing and you run across it. What are you running toward from Paul's metaphor? What's your goal? What's your teleos? What's the end? So let's run the race that's set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. So what's the goal line? Jesus himself. In the process of what God's bringing us through right now, our eyes need to stay on who Jesus is. Just like a track runner stays on the track, but his goal is the goal over there. Now, interestingly enough, in the nation of Israel with Elijah, this was their problem. Because they came into the land and they thought that they had crossed the finish line. But they hadn't. The finish line really was relationship and community with God. And they'd never really quite gotten it. It was the place where that was going to happen, but it was still the track, even though it was the place. God wanted for them to find life in his nearness, in his presence, in his sovereign kingship. That's exactly what Elijah was trying to steer them back toward. Why are you putting your trust in Baal? Because Baal can't do it. You know, hey, go ahead, bring down some fire and suck up that sacrifice. You know, all these things that clearly Elijah was trying to say, you find life from God. He really is here. He's the one that's here. This is what makes this land a special place. But they wouldn't believe that. So they took their eyes away from who God was as well. The founder and the perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, talking about Jesus, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So what the writer of Hebrews is talking about, and he's talking about this cloud of witnesses, the Old Testament people like Elijah is included. He's saying this is the normal Christian life coming out of Hebrews. It's fully detailed for us in the Old Testament. There were all those people back there whose eyes were set on God himself, and that was right. But when they set their eyes just on the promised land, thinking this was the end of everything, it's not the end. It's still the process. And so they took their eyes off. They steered away. Elijah and Isaiah and Ezekiel, all these guys are trying to say, don't do that. Keep God at the center, or else God will give you another land where God is not there. So he's the author and the perfecter of our faith. He's the one that brings us into the land of promise. He's the one that continues to keep our eyes toward God himself. He's the one that maintains the fact that we need to keep our eyes on Jesus himself. So what do you do as you run your race? Well, like a runner of the race, you watch that goal line. And for us, that active process every day is keeping our eyes on Jesus. It's what Elijah tried to tell a nation. It's what Moses wrestled with, trying to tell the nation to do. See, again, if you roll back to Moses, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they thought, woohoo, we've crossed the finish line. We're out of Egypt. No, that was step one in the process. And Moses is the one that got them there. They got in the land, and when they got in the land, they said, woohoo, we've crossed the finish line. No, you still haven't crossed the finish line. The finish line is a mature and abiding dependence on God. That's the finish line. And the only way we can do that today is to keep our eyes on Jesus and go that direction. Go that direction. Now, before you kind of mess with this, it isn't an issue of getting on the track of life and trying to imitate Jesus because we see him at the goal. That's not it at all. We are running in his direction, but who's the author and the perfecter? Jesus is. So the goal himself is also the active agent who's changing us to be like him. So don't get stuck on this metaphor and think that, well, I got to run faster today because I sinned yesterday and I'm going to keep looking at Jesus. Well, yeah. No, our process, and when we keep our eyes on Jesus, is saying, I'm coming your direction. I want to go toward you. I want all of who you are. But Lord, today, I give you all the sinfulness. I give you all my flesh. I just can't. You're the perfecter of who I am. You're the one who's taking me to the goal, to the teleos, not me. You started me on this track when you brought me into this land of promise. But now it's not about this track. It's all about you. I watch you. Well, that was Elijah as well. He was the one who tried to keep the eyes of Israel on God himself, and they still sinned and didn't do it. That was the problem. I think, let me go back. So let me just make one closing comment, and then we'll be done. Most of these passages, like I told you about this last week or week before, the narratives are really short. The story's really short. Where God and the Holy Spirit changes you is when you push back from the table and you think about that and say, God, what are you saying? I don't know what you're saying. Most of the Old Testament is not about chewing on the details of the story. The stories come easily. The question is what does it mean? And to an ancient Israelite, they would see this. They would see Moses, and they would see Elijah, and they'd say, I know what these two guys did, how God used them. I can see how this works together. In a really soft sense, Moses is the beginning, Elijah is the ongoing and sort of the end. But they're trying to accomplish the same thing. Having God at the center of people's lives. They would recognize this symbolically. So you and I are not used to that kind of thinking. So if you get to a passage, especially in the Old Testament, and you say, what is that all about? You need to push back from the table and think, well, God, I need your understanding because I don't get this. And he brings an understanding. In a couple of weeks, we were talking earlier this morning with Joan about the she-bears that kill the youth. What? Well, just read a little forward. You'll see what we're talking about. And it's a classic case where you'll look at this and go, what? So read ahead a little bit. Read the passage. It goes very fast. The narrative is very clear and simple. There's no magic in it. And then push back and prayerfully say, God, I don't get it. What are you trying to show? Why did you include this? This looks like the stupidest story in the entire Old Testament to include. Why did you include this deliberately? And we'll see where he takes us. So that's what we do. I'm just your tour guide in this trip through the Old Testament, and we'll notice things, and we'll scratch our heads, and we'll push back, and we'll think, and we'll pray, and we'll try and tie it together and get the biggest picture we can get. In this particular case with Elijah, you need the big picture. It's also why when you talk about Elijah, you're talking about the bringing to the fruition end of what God's intention is, which is why when you have the transfiguration and you have Jesus gets met by Moses and Elijah, what Jesus is about to do in going to the cross when they show up to him is the fulfillment of what everything Moses wanted and everything Elijah wanted. And they were used in the Old Testament in a metaphorical way with the real nation of Israel, and now Jesus is going to do it in a real way for the entire world. So we could talk about the parallels to Hebrews 12 all morning, but anyway. So let me just tell you what we're going to do. Coming up, we're going to stay in 2 Kings 2, but it's not going to be about Elijah. It's going to be about Elisha, the apprentice. So we're going to start the apprentice when we come back to 2 Kings 2, and we'll look at Elisha. Elisha basically has maybe two to three times the amount of page space that Elijah does. And we don't know anything about the guy. We really don't. So that'll actually be exciting. There's some crazy things that probably some of the craziest things in the entire Old Testament happen with Elisha. So that's what we're going to do. And then again, Dorothy mentioned next week we're going to have these ministry updates. And don't miss these because this will actually be fun. It sounds kind of like boring. It sounds like a congregational meeting or something. But what we're encouraging people who are going to talk about what God's doing in that context. So Earl Erskine will be here. Earl and his wife are coming up. They're going to do a quickie to tell us what's going on there. Amazing things. Doris can't come up. She's got commitments, but we're going to do a little video edit interview with her, so we'll show her via that. So them plus all of us doing things. God's doing amazing things in and through us, things that you don't know about that are extraordinarily encouraging. So that's why we're doing that next week. This is the life of God through his Holy Spirit in us right now that you may not know about. So I'm really looking forward to it. It'll be fun. Well, let's pray. And you guys can lead us in one more song. Father in heaven, we thank you for your great loving kindness to us that you show to us over and over and over again. We thank you that you've brought us into this land of promise as being your children through what Christ has done. And we thank you that you continue us on the process and goal toward you as we keep your eyes on you through what Jesus has done as well in our hearts. It's an astonishing thing. We thank you for documenting for us this life of Elijah. It's been so encouraging, so eye-opening. And Lord, at this very end, we understand with great confidence and assurance that when things come to an end for us, just like with Elijah, that was the plan all along. And so when we complete your goals, your teleos for us in our generation, we're done. And there's nothing accidental about that. So Lord, we thank you for the great privilege you give us to use us in the lives of other people as your Holy Spirit's in us, and to talk about the great loving kindness of this wonderful Creator God who loves us so immensely. Why would you entrust such an important message to regular guys like us? I don't know, but you do, and it's an extraordinary privilege as we get a front row seat on how your Spirit works in and through people around us. So thank you for including us in all this. It's a great encouragement, and we thank you for the life of Elijah, and we thank you for these wonderful words now. In Jesus' name, amen.